Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about community wealth building. My name is Margot Brandenburg, and I'm a senior program officer at the Ford Foundation in New York City. I am thrilled to be here today with two people who I admire greatly, Connecticut State Treasurer Sean Wooden and Economic Security Project co-founder Natalie Foster. I will not attempt to do either of their bios justice since we've been assigned an enormous topic in just 30 minutes. But I will just introduce them by saying that Treasurer Wooden took office in 2019 after a successful career in law and after serving as the Hartford City Council president, and is now president of NAST as of this month. Natalie is co-founder and co-chair of the Economic Security Project and fellow at the Aspen Institute's Future of Work initiative, and has previously served in founding and executive roles across the nonprofit sector. And I personally have had the privilege of seeing them both work tirelessly and creatively in different ways to advance a more equitable and fair economy and society. So our topic this morning is community wealth building, and the Ford Foundation has been working for decades to build broad-based community wealth. And in the last 2 years, we have seen an increase in focus on the topic as the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd in 2020 have exposed the inequities and the interdependencies of American society. And I'll just preface the conversation by saying that there's a large range of topics that come to mind when we talk about community wealth building. And we're going to focus this morning on the specific and really complementary work that Treasurer Wooden and Natalie have been doing. And I won't provide a barrage of statistics, but just say that the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families has more than doubled between 1989 and 2016. And has only gotten more acute in the K-shaped recovery that we've seen from the pandemic. So with those grim statistics as background, Natalie, let's start with you. When we spoke earlier this week, you mentioned that you think about economic security and wealth building as a stool with 3 legs. Can you tell us about the legs of that stool and how you see them fitting together?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us, Margot and Treasurer Wooden. It's great to be here with you and all these innovators. I'm loving this conversation. So community wealth, really important topic. And there's actually so many factors that go in, but for me, a 3-legged stool has been helpful. The first being wages. That is traditionally how we think of how we move wealth to households and therefore community wealth. Wages from work. And, I think beyond wages, job quality is incredibly important. I think, the Aspen Institute has done great work on looking holistically at jobs, what makes a quality job, but a huge part of that is wages. And as we've noted, we are actually seeing them go up, which I think is a sign of hope, but there's a lot further for them to go in order for one job to be enough in America today. So one part wages, a second part wealth. And I know this is where Treasurer Wooden has done some really exciting work. And it's incredibly important to look at income and wealth. Wealth is where we see the incredibly shameful statistics around the racial wealth gap that we allow in America today, where median white households have 10 times the wealth of median Black households. And it's a lot harder to look at from a policy perspective. So ideas like baby bonds are starting to get at how we think about shifting that racial wealth gap and the broader wealth gap in America. But the third leg of this stool, I would argue, is non-labor income and tax credits, money that comes in no matter what happens in the labor market or the wealth market. And that is one of the easiest ways to imagine it right now is the child tax credit. So for the past 6 months, thanks to the American Rescue Plan, nearly every parent in America has received checks every month with no strings attached, coming directly into their bank account from the IRS. And parents are using those checks in all the different ways to support their family in all the different ways that families need. So some families are fixing transmissions in the car to go back to work. Other families are paying down medical debt. Some families are putting 3 meals on the table a day, and others are buying the athletic uniforms that they need for their kid to go out for the football team finally. And we all know the expense of parenting. So the child tax credit is a great example of income that sits alongside wages and wealth building measures, and I think creates more resilience among American families, given the fact that we are in a very chaotic period and perhaps a very chaotic decade as we look at both the climate crisis and the pandemic that is once again raging around us?
Thanks, Natalie. Maybe framing this as the income sheet and the the income statement on the balance sheet of families, not just looking at one in isolation. Treasurer Wooden, your leadership and your approach to addressing wealth inequality has been multifaceted, and you have worked what I would describe as from the ground up through a groundbreaking baby bonds program, but also from the top down through an intentional strategy to invest the state's capital in diverse managers. Can you tell us how you chose your priorities and what's gone into developing your strategy to address the wealth gap?
Yeah, thank you, Margot. Great to be with you again. And Natalie, great to be with you. The priorities, in some respects, the priorities chose me in terms of the moment that I happen to be a treasurer. And, obviously I have a broader commitment to these issues, but the reality of what our country has undergone within the past few years, with a racial reckoning, a pandemic, which just exposed so many pre-existing inequities in society in terms of frontline workers, low-wage workers, and their value kind of in the whole scheme. And so in some respects, the moment chose me in terms of shaping priorities. As treasurer, I have to pay the bills and invest the pension fund assets and lots of different things. But within that, I felt like we needed, as a state, a bolder response to meet the moment of where we were. And that's why I proposed and championed the passage of Connecticut baby bonds, which, I'm proud that it's, first in the nation. But the idea is for it not to be the last. And, Connecticut baby bonds, the idea, of course, is many of you know, was inspired by the federal proposal put forward by Senator Cory Booker, Representative Ayanna Pressley, which unfortunately has not moved. But and a lot of research over a long period of time, kind of supporting the framework for how that could be a powerful tool for addressing the racial wealth gap, and which I've been very focused on. And so our program was passed, signed into law last July, and what it does is for every baby born into poverty in Connecticut, poverty is measured by whether their mom is on the state Medicaid program. There is a trust set up that we will fund, and we will invest that over a period of 18 to 30 years for the child. And so between the ages of 18 to 30, that's when the beneficiary can claim the funds. And once they have to be a Connecticut resident, and they have to take a financial education course. Those two things, and the usage is for limited purposes, all geared towards closing the wealth gap in terms of metrics: higher education, home ownership in Connecticut, investing in a business or starting a business in Connecticut, and retirement security. So those four buckets, based on the research tied to that. And the last point in terms of the connectivity here, there is a 2019 Columbia University study, which analyzed the federal proposal and concluded that this could be one of the most powerful tools to close the wealth gap among young adults. And so lots of sound research, and happy to be the first in the nation, but also engaged with Senator Booker and others, and been to Capitol Hill to lobby, met with the Biden White House to broaden this on a federal level, because I think we need innovation, and we need focus specifically on closing this. In Connecticut, to what may be obvious for some and not for others, we are ground zero for the wealth gap, the income gap. When you talk about the three legs to that stool, right? I mean, you're looking at Connecticut.
The stool is wobbly in Connecticut as well, or falling over it without your interventions. Thank you for your leadership. And I guess, Natalie, the treasurer said that the moment chose him, but Treasurer Wooden is in good company, and that there are state and city officials around the country that are innovating, maybe in different ways, but innovating and thinking creatively about using public and in some cases private capital. You work across the country. Tell us about some of the leadership and innovations you've seen coming from the public sector.
Yeah, if you think about the stool, so, we're seeing wages go up. We're seeing important interventions like Treasurer Wooden's on the wealth gap. On the non-labor income side or the tax credit side, I think we're seeing such interesting innovation around the idea of, regular recurring cash to families that ultimately would be guaranteed, an income guarantee. But we're seeing the innovation is around using the tax credits as the rails to get cash to families. So modernization and expansion of the earned income tax credit, for example, or creation of state child tax credits, which we've now seen at the federal level, like Gavin Newsom just announced this week in his budget, where he said California will continue to expand the young child tax credit, which is money directly to parents. And I think that's great. With the earned income tax credit, which has been around for 40 years, is bipartisan, we're seeing excellent thinking around how to modernize and expand it. So nearly 30 states plus Washington, 30 states plus Washington, D.C. have their own earned income tax credits, on the books. And we're seeing folks expand the credit, expand eligibility and the amount, making it available to more people. And I think that is the route we have to go. Washington State most recently passed an expansion of their tax credit tied to a capital gains expansion as well. And you're seeing the mayors pick up this idea and run with it through the idea of demonstrating guaranteed income. Now, these demonstrations started in Stockton with Mayor Michael Tubbs about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was private dollars, which Economic Security Project was proud to put in, that kicked it off. But now there's about 60 mayors who are demonstrating this idea around the country in their cities, many of them using public dollars at this point. 500 families with $500 coming in with no strings attached. And what does that mean in people's lives? Well, what we know from Stockton is it means stress levels go down and people finding meaningful, higher paying employment goes up at double the rate of the control group. So all around, having a steady flow of income that sits alongside your wages and your wealth building measures is a real benefit to families.
It's fantastic. And I'll just add, from a foundation's perspective, I think there's no better use case than being able to use philanthropy to fund a demonstration that then public officials can scale at a level that's far beyond even the resources of a Ford Foundation. So it's hugely exciting, I think, from multiple stakeholder perspectives. But Treasurer Wooden, let's come back to Connecticut. You talked about baby bonds. I know Connecticut has been an early pioneer in the use of green bonds, but now you're into S bonds, which the S in ESG is something that's near and dear to our hearts at Ford. Can you tell us about the Community Investment Fund program?
So yes, we are, also at the forefront of social bonds at this point. In fact, we just sold 300 million last month, or we're closing this month. But the idea is there's increasingly an appetite in the marketplace for investors to actually invest in what we call social bonds. There are some definitions for that, but basically bonds used for the public good. In our most recent case, education, quality education is one of the categories. And so issuing for new school constructions in areas that desperately need them. But there are a variety of categories. Green bonds, we have issued a number of green bonds for a variety of projects related to water related and otherwise. And so, we see increasing demand, and, we are happy to kind of lean into that space and help build the market.
Fascinating. And I remember when green bonds first started to get popular, and conventional wisdom is that there were reasons to do it, but those reasons did not include better pricing necessarily. But when we at the Ford Foundation issued $1 billion social bond of our own in 2020 to allow us to double grant making to kind of meet the moment that you described, there's no perfect counterfactual, but the bankers that helped us underwrite that issuance estimate that we saved about 30 basis points on 30 and 50-year bonds based on having been rated but as a social bond and the presence of sort of ESG buyers in the buying pool. I'm curious, do you see any sort of pricing benefits on the horizon, or is that limited to private issuers?
No, I think there are definitely increasing pricing benefits, and markets shift, right? If we just take renewable energy, at one point, it was just so costly in the early stages of renewables to invest in that. And now it's at a scale and the market's developed enough where you can actually do it cheaper. And so I think this is similar, where in the early days there's no market, but there's an interest of folks, but the market is developing. And so we were able to recently market bonds specifically, and we had specific investors who were, institutional investors interested in, become ESG investors. And so I think that's changing the equation dramatically, and just the broader, even on the retail side, just a broader awareness of the importance of these types of issues. I think it's changing the landscape and making it, there's value added, and which can be seen in pricing towards these bond issuances.
Fascinating. Can you say more about your conversations with investors and how they're responding, in particular to that S in ESG, which for a long time was a bit of an underdog and sort of paled in comparison to the E. But as you talk to investors, what are you hearing?
There's just increasing interest and demand. People, a lot of people. I'm an optimist, and a lot of people in our country really do want to do the right thing, and they do want to make our communities better, and having more vehicles to do so, I think is what I know from conversations is very attractive. And there are conversations underway that have not, reached a level of maturation to actually roll out new things. But, really people are kicking around these ideas in the public finance community, as well as in the, kind of private investment community as well. When we think of ESG, it actually runs throughout our thinking around investments, but it's not something that we impose on investment managers. But when they pitch, it's we do evaluate it as part of our diligence process, but it's a part of the story of how they think about investing and maximizing value. So I think, the landscape is very exciting in that regard. And we're going to see, I think, see a lot more products. The other thing that I want to note about the S is that the Moody's, the rating agency, they actually evaluate these different factors, including the S. And there's a kind of scoring of states and thinking about kind of a social score and metric. And so I think that's another significant indicator when you have rating agencies considering kind of ESG factors in highlighting the S, or the S being kind of, an important component that they measure. I think we're gonna see more activity in this space.
That's fascinating. And, in the sort of wonky world of inclusive capitalism, there's been a lot of discussion about single versus double materiality, right? Whether ESG factors are looked at purely through the prism of what investors need and want versus whether those factors are material to stakeholders. And there's been, I think, an implicit understanding that there's a binary. And when you're talking about what's happening at Moody's and elsewhere, it seems like actually there's probably a convergence, right? Where investors cannot benefit if society and the environment do not. And that convergence, I think, is really powerful.
Absolutely. And, there was, as you know, debate for many years as to whether or not investors should even think about these issues, whether or not, as fiduciaries, the relationship. And the answer is absolutely. The data is increasingly powerful, and seeing the movement separate and apart from what I'll call the true believers, but seeing the movement in the private sector of considering these factors, it's a changed landscape. My first meeting with a rating agency, going back to that, I remember the question they asked: what is Connecticut doing to address climate change and coastal resiliency? And they're talking about the E, right? And so we look at all these factors, and increasingly this is, it's moving from or it has moved from a fringe questionable consideration to an intrinsic part of thinking about value preservation, creation, systemic risk reduction. So that's what I'm seeing.
I love that. And I personally could talk about the mainstreaming of ESG all day. But Natalie, I want to go back to your three-legged stool and make sure that we're also grounding the conversation in the experience of families, in addition to investors. You mentioned, that wage income is going up, and there's a lot of discussion right now about the Great Resignation. How is the tight labor market impacting that relationship between the first and third legs of your stool, right? The wage and the non-wage income.
Yeah, I think that poverty in America is a policy choice. And that is it is clear in the fact that during this great complicated period we lived through, this recession, that we actually have seen poverty go down. And the reason it's gone down is because we made a choice to support families through the CARES Act, through the American Rescue Plan, which is now expired. So congressional gridlock is standing in the way of continuing that choice. But just the child tax credit alone cut child poverty in America by 40%. So this Friday, the Friday of this week, will be the first time that American parents have woken up and will not receive a check from the government in the form of the child tax credit. It will be the first month where that is expired and congressional gridlock, has stood in the way, reminding us it was a choice we made to reduce poverty in the middle of a pandemic and a recession. And it's a choice we can continue to make, and will at the state level and the city level, thanks to folks like Treasurer Wooden and innovators in the laboratories of democracy. But so what does it mean? One thing it means is that the Great Resignation is not people resigning and going off to live in #van life. The Great Resignation is actually a great shuffling in the job market, and people are leaving lower paid jobs that don't serve them well, for higher paid jobs. And that's why we're seeing about a 10% increase across the hospitality sector, a sector that is known for precarious work and low wages. And employers are having to fight for employees. And frankly, after a very long period of wage stagnation in America and the rise of precarious work, I think it's really good to see wages increasing. And I know it's hard at the local level, and there are policy measures we can put in place to support small businesses, but we have to see wages go up in America. And I think one of the outcomes of people having more cash in their pocket is that we're actually able to take a risk and find a job that pays them more, a job that they like better, a job that has hours that fit their child's schedule. Simple things that people take for granted when they're at the higher end of the income scale and have flexibility. And so I think that's what we're seeing, and I hope we see more of it, because frankly, in a functioning democracy, there are checks and balances in capitalism. And one of the balances we've seen gone for a long time is that of labor being organized. And so while we're still a far cry from that, I think more worker power is something that in the long run is good for this country.
And if I could follow up on that, going back to this concept of convergence, right? I focus, of course, on our state's economy in Connecticut, and thinking about, oftentimes, policymakers, we think about these in disconnected ways, right? But increasing wages for lower income workers is actually good for local economies in terms of, the spend and the recycling of the dollar, and how much that increased wage, relative to someone in the top 1% bracket, how much it actually translates into in terms of a greater circulation in communities and further strengthening, from an economic sustainability model.
So real macro benefits in addition to the micro benefits experienced at the household level. Natalie, I think, we're covering so much ground here. And so while we're at it, just maybe a quick moment on research that your organization does on anti-monopoly issues. And I just wondered if you could take a minute, mostly to tease our brains, to say how you think about the sort of Amazonification of the economy that folks have talked about, and how that impacts this conversation on wealth building and on an economic well-being. Just a teaser, and then we'll direct folks to your site.
Yeah. Across the country, we're seeing increased corporate concentration across all kinds of sectors. We talk a lot about it in tech, but it's happening in agriculture, airlines, so forth. And the impact is on individual families is significant. Thousands of dollars families spend just on higher prices due to corporate concentration in this country. And when you pair that with, the rising prices of gas and goods, it's significant for families. So it's very important, I think, that we go back to an anti-monopoly framework and recognize that we can help shape markets through government action. And so it's exciting to see the president take this seriously. He has put in place a number of appointees who are people who really recognize that in order to support innovation in this country and to help grow small businesses, we have to have markets that function. And that takes, there's a role for government in that.
Thank you. Treasurer Wooden, one more question for you before we end with closing thoughts. You are newly the president of NAST, the National Association of State Treasurers, which I can only imagine adds additional responsibilities to your already very full plate. Can you talk about the value you see in exchanging among peers, and what motivated you to take that leadership role at NAST?
Sure. So NASH is National Association of State Treasurers, a bipartisan organization of treasurers across the country and U.S. territories. It reached out to me before I was sworn in as treasurer, offering some webinars, right? And so that's how I got involved kind of right away. And just the value of collaboration, of sharing best practices, ideas, similar challenges throughout the country. So, in the pandemic, for example, we had a weekly call at the beginning of the pandemic, and dealing with issues of the liquidity crisis that hit some states more than others, and how we're navigating. And so having a community that engages in a bipartisan way, one that's novel in America today. So that was refreshing, but to really engage on these things. This year, one of the things, apropos of some of the conversation we're having, is addressing like the silver tsunami and what's happening generally we have the silver tsunami, it is even more acute in the public sector, public workforce sector, and public finance in particular. So one of my top priorities this year as president is actually taking the work from a study we commissioned to implementing ways to address that.
Thank you. And I have so much more to ask both of you, but I'm getting increasingly escalating messages that we're out of time. So I think we need to leave it there. And I just want to say thanks to both of you for sharing your time and your insights. I thought this was fabulous, and I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
This was great. Too short.